It's time to conclude my Trilogy of Spider-Man Versus videos. Today we are going to compare Spider-Man 3 with Spider-Man No Way Home. We are also going to throw Into the Spider-Verse into the conversation and see which movie did a better job with the Multiverse storyline. So, let's get to it. This is the final episode of my Spider-Man Versus trilogy. Let the battle commence. Something that all of these movies have in common is that they have a lot of characters. In Spider-Man 3 we have a lot of villains, in No Way Home we have a lot of villains, and in Into the Spider-Verse we have a lot of heroes and villains. Spider-Man 3 makes an admirable attempt at juggling them, No Way Home just about passes, and Into the Spider-Verse did so well that people actually said they could have thrown in even more villains and heroes and it wouldn't have been overkill. And as for the stories themselves, Spider-Man 3 is trying to juggle too much at once. There is a very admirable attempt at showcasing how flawed these characters are, such as Peter and Mary Jane, and although it doesn't make them 100% likable, I would say that they feel the most like real people. Peter has been mostly hated as Spider-Man, and now he is loved and he has developed a bit of an ego. Mary Jane's acting career isn't taking off to the point that she has gotten replaced, and she doesn't feel like Peter is giving her the support and attention that she needs. Even though I thought that getting back on the horse thing was actually really good advice.
Don't give me the horse thing.
Fine. And Harry is struggling with his friendship with Peter and ultimately decides to kill him. So there are a lot of personal friendships and character storylines going on. And then you get Sandman, which can be considered overkill, but not quite. You must have the villain in there. It offsets the main character's struggles and gives them an external threat to deal with and not just an internal threat. Where it becomes overkill is with the symbiote that the studio forced in here whether the director Sam Raimi wanted it or not. And it shows, as it throws the whole story out of balance. We have this producer to thank for that, Avi Arad, who Spider-Man No Way Home inexplicably thanks in the credits. What they should have wrote was this. See, you can thank him for it, but you gotta be honest. So I like the story for Spider-Man 3, but yeah, the symbiote really drags it down in the grand scheme of things. And true to its name, it's a parasite that binds to its victim, that being the script, and as Dr. Connors put it,
sometimes these things, when they bind, they can be hard to unbind.
As for Into the Spider-Verse, the story follows Miles Morales, who is going through his own Spider-Man transformation and origin story. And I like how the different Spider-Mans all get pulled in from the multiverse. The movie does a very good job of showing individually how they all got involved in this multiverse of madness.
You see, I was in New York, but things were different. Also, I was dead. I have a feeling that the thing that brought me here was the thing that got him killed. You want to know what happened next? Me too.
No Way Home, on the other hand, implies that the characters know something is up with Holland Spider-Man and that he's in pain, but it doesn't tell you how they know or why they are acting so casual about getting sucked into a whole nother universe. I mean, Maguire Spider-Man would see this portal and be like,
What is this?
but instead, he doesn't even question it.
Hello. I hope it's okay. I just came through this, just closed.
I found this very weird and distracting. I mean, he's turning behind him to see a teleporting portal, not Mr. Dickovich's room. This made his entrance really awkward and strange to me, and it felt very out of character. And I don't even know what this was about.
Wait, he's not your friend.
And then they start talking to each other like nothing happened. Although I did like how both Maguire and Garfield react to Lola like she's a normal civilian. Now I didn't realize this, but then I found that when Stranger's spell went wrong, it turns out that as well as the villains, he also pulled Maguire and Garfield into this world, because apparently they know the identity of Spider-Man as well. At which case, where were Maguire and Garfield this whole time? Were they just vacationing in this universe? They found the other villain so quickly, how did they not find two other Spider-Mans? And not only that, but if they came through via Stranger's portal, that means that Mary Jane, Gwen Stacy, Eddie Brock, Harry, and Harry should also be pulled into this world too, because they knew Spider-Man's identity as well. But for some reason, they aren't here, because the movie clearly did not think this whole multiverse storyline through, and they just picked and chose whoever they wanted. Even Electro, who never even knew who Spider-Man was.
I just thought you was gonna be black.
There are several plot holes in this movie, and I don't like how Marvel have poorly and very conveniently implemented the multiverse into this story. Into the Spider-Verse, on the other hand, did a much better job at bringing the different Spider-Mans in from the multiverse. Green Goblin unknowingly put Spider-Man into the multiverse beam thinking it will kill him, when really it brings all the Spider-Mans into his world. See? That's coherent and easy to understand. And there's a nice little detail that if the other Spider-Man stay out of their world for too long, then they will die. That added a nice bit of tension. And now we get to the rest of the story for Spider-Man No Way Home. The first minute of No Way Home was great. The tone was serious, the feeling of everyone finding out Peter was Spider-Man felt dangerous, and then almost immediately, the jokes came in and so did the goofy music, and it felt like we had jumped straight into another MCU comedy. Now, there was definitely good stuff in the first hour, but aside from our main characters getting questioned once, none of the stakes felt severe. Even the way the teachers and Flash react to Peter's identity is played up for laughs. They even throw the danger off by having Matt Murdock show up and say,
"Well, I have some good news, Peter. I don't believe any of the charges against you are gonna stick."
And I was like, wait, what? Of course they will stick. Do you remember this line in Daredevil Season 3 when someone gives their final dying statement?
The court says that a person who believes that they're dying has less incentive to lie. Therefore, anything they say is...
You're telling me this is admissible in court?
Every damn word.
This is the exact same situation, except it's not Matt Murdock using this on Kingpin, it's Mysterio using it on Spider-Man. And Matt Murdock should be in shock that they are using the exact same airtight tactic that he used to put Kingpin away to put Peter away. And he should be thinking, how the hell am I supposed to defend my client against this? This could be a court case where Matt Murdock thinks he's going to lose, and Peter, Ned, MJ, and Aunt May are going to be sent to prison. And maybe it even ties back to Pepper Potts for knowing that Peter was Spider-Man, and then even she can face jail time for being an accessory and providing him with his Spider-Man gear, leaving little Morgan on her own, and then of course Happy will get charged as well. And that's what compels Peter to go to Doctor Strange and ask the Master Magician for help. Not that he can't get into college, but like I've always said, Marvel don't know how to do that kind of smart storytelling, so they just throw the whole court case off as if it's nothing, and then that big cliffhanger that was teased in Far From Home is over. I actually predicted this all the way back when Far From Home came out. Watch. As much as I enjoyed watching the film, it's this disposable nature of the Marvel movies that has me worried for the next Spider-Man film, because without the smart and deep writing, the situation he is in is not going to be much of a problem at all, and it will be dealt with in an underwhelming way. And it's not because I'm just a mindless MCU hater, I predicted it because I know the MCU too well, and I know that they are capable of being fun comic book movies, but they are not capable of being smart comic book movies, like a Christopher Nolan comic book movie, like Netflix's Daredevil or Todd Phillips' Joker, and yes, I'm gonna say it, Matt Reeves' The Batman movie. These comic book properties have the talent behind them to be smart, but the MCU is not able to be smart with the stories like them. So what does it do with the biggest and smartest part of its story? It just skips it altogether and goes back to doing what it usually does, which is making more jokes and being a super lighthearted comic book film. I'm not the only one to think this. The first hour of Spider-Man No Way Home has so many problems. Things are just so convenient. Peter's identity as Spider-Man should have been a huge plot point that lasted a whole movie, but it was resolved and thrown away in like 5 minutes. And the humor is non-stop and takes away from the tension and potential character development, and you get massive lapses in logic, such as Doctor Strange very easily being convinced to make a spell for Peter just so he and his friends can go to college.
It's too dangerous. Yeah, we've used it for a lot less. Do you remember the full moon party at Carmitage?
No.
Exactly.
Oh, so this movie is now saying that Strange has used multiverse risking magic for a party. Yeah, everyone has been saying this since the trailers and I was one of them. Doctor Strange is not that stupid. He has talked about how seriously he takes his duties before, and this is very out of character for him to so easily risk not just the world, but the whole multiverse just so he can get Peter into college. Wow, that sounds even more ridiculous when I say it out loud.
I'm sorry. Are you telling me that you didn't even think to plead your case with him first before you asked me to brainwash the entire world?
Whether he called the college or not, that doesn't matter. You shouldn't have performed that spell for him, Strange. Do him a little favor, help him out on a date, fix his grade, but don't risk all this just so you can get Peter and his friends into college. You know, it's funny how in Spider-Verse, Kingpin is responsible for opening the multiverse and potentially dooming all of humanity to bring his dead wife and child back, and in No Way Home, it's Doctor Strange trying to get Peter into college. How does the cartoon here have much smarter writing than the live-action movie? And even after this, everything is so generic MCU and the stakes from earlier don't even feel like they are a problem anymore. Peter just goes around using his powers and taking his mask off in front of crowds of people and there are no consequences for it. And the new stakes that show up are dealt with so easily. And Peter is so dumb to have a group of criminals in one building where he constantly leaves his Aunt May with them unsupervised. But then we get into the second half where all of a sudden the tone changes and the movie massively cuts down on the jokes and it actually becomes the MCU movie that I've wanted to see for all these years. Suddenly it has tension and it makes the characters have an emotional journey and they actually grow for the first time in these MCU Spider-Man movies. And this culminates with the first true loss that Tom Holland's Spider-Man has ever experienced in these films, the death of Aunt May. This was a great scene because she didn't even realize that she was dying, and the performances from the two are fantastic. The only problem with this scene is the previous two movies. Aunt May was just the attractive aunt in those films. She never felt like a true parental figure to Peter like Maguire's Aunt May or Miles' Uncle Aaron. They gave her some character in this movie, but it's too late at this point. You needed to develop her over a longer period, not at the last minute. I mean, in Homecoming, she only had one good scene with Peter, which is not enough. In Far From Home, she is only there to be the butt of a running joke, that being, is Aunt May going out with Happy? She genuinely contributed nothing in that film. And now, they finally give her some development and show what Aunt May's job is, which I couldn't even remember if they told us before. And then she dies in the third movie, so I didn't feel sad for her, I felt sad for Peter, and I felt emotional because of the situation itself, that someone's loved one is dying and she doesn't even know it. And the music in the scene was great too, which also helped make the scene more emotional. But unfortunately, I didn't care about the character that died, because like I said, this Aunt May was just presented as a joke throughout these films. She was the attractive aunt, nothing more, nothing less. She didn't compare at all to the previous two Aunt Mays, who were actually fully developed parental figures in Peter's life. I mean, geez, the running joke about her being attractive got more of an arc throughout the three films than her character did. And if her and Happy didn't just have a fling and actually had something serious going on, then this scene also would have been more emotional and Happy reacting to her death would have been more sad, as this could have been a potential family that was building throughout the three films without us even realizing. And him helping Peter here would have felt like it was coming from a more fatherly place as opposed to a friendly one. And him getting arrested trying to buy time for Peter would have been more emotional too, as with the scene where he forgets who Peter is. It would have greatly added to Peter's loss and would have worked as the dismantling of a potential family that Peter could have had but has now lost. And it would have made more sense as to why Peter told Strange that he wanted Happy to remember who he was as well. But no, summer fling, because like I've said, the MCU prioritized jokes over character development, and as a result, I didn't feel anything, and my younger brother, he said when Happy showed up he was laughing inside, and that's because everything between them was done for a joke. It wasn't genuine. The deaths of Harry and Uncle Aaron were much more sad and impactful because these characters were built up and had fully developed relationships that we saw throughout the course of the films, as opposed to Aunt May, who most of the time was just there for a cheap laugh. So the feeling of loss felt much heavier in Spider-Man 3 and Into the Spider-Verse. No Way Home had potential, but it threw it all away, because attractive Aunt May and summer fling jokes, am I right? So which movies have the overall superior story? Well, Into the Spider-Verse is a movie that gets better the more times I see it. And again, the fact that it's able to cram so much characters into this one movie is an absolutely stunning accomplishment. Spider-Man 3 and No Way Home, on the other hand, both suffered from cramming in too much story into one film. And unlike Spider-Verse, they weren't able to accommodate them. Spider-Man No Way Home had two stories in one film, and rather than give ample time to both, they just threw one out in the first 8 minutes and then went all out on the second. And Spider-Man 3 tried to hold it all together as best as it could, but it just fell apart in the end. So, it's a little tricky deciding between Spider-Man 3 and No Way Home because I don't think either of their stories are great, but in the end, the better story largely relies on the build-up of the previous two films and just how much they work towards setting up the character and story payoffs of the third film. So the movies with the superior story and characters is Into the Spider-Verse, Spider-Man 3, and finally, Spider-Man No Way Home. The Spider-Mans in these three films are in very different places with regards to their stories, so let's compare these two Spider-Mans in their third outing first. Now for the first hour of No Way Home, Tom Holland is still coasting through the film and has no growth to his arc. His development only started to get going once he decided to save the villains rather than let them die, and it properly got going when his Aunt May died, which is well over an hour into the film. But with that being said, this is the most development that Tom Holland has had out of his 3 standalone movies and 3 crossover appearances. And I was so glad to see him finally get a full-on character arc. I also like the choice that he made to take the box away from Strange. This was the first interesting character choice that his Spider-Man made in any of these movies, and his decision to help them did feel like a very Spider-Man thing to do, which is the first for Tom Holland's Spider-Man, and it showed that he is finally showing some growth. And by the end of the movie, for the first time, I actually saw him as Spider-Man. Usually if you were to ask me what I thought about Tom Holland being Spider-Man, I would be Otto Octavius in this situation.
Do you know a Peter Parker who's Spider-Man?
Yes.
Is that him?
No.
But by the end of this movie, Tom Holland is no longer Spider-Boy or Iron Boy, he is actually Spider-Man. Now even though he was given growth, a big part of me did feel that it was too little too late. Why is he just learning about these things now? I feel like these are old lessons that he is learning, and I couldn't help but feel that I was watching a hero story that I should have seen years ago. Instead, we got 2 filler stories which just felt like placeholders rather than relevant movies that you have to see. And even though he grows as Spider-Man, he still makes some really dumb decisions that are too dumb. Now in Spider-Man 3, Maguire does some dumb stuff too, but Holland does stuff that is worse. As I said earlier, he leaves his aunt in a room by herself with these villains that could turn at any moment, he ruins the spell that Strange stupidly did, and Strange does make several changes to the spell and he still makes more requests. And the movie gives him so many conveniences and plot armor, which is something that Maguire definitely does not get. Everything Maguire did, every mistake, every stupid decision had consequences. He loses relationships, he becomes vengeful, and he acts on his emotions, and then once the deed is done, he has to realize the reality of what he has done and what he is becoming.
Who are you?
You know who I am.
I do.
Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
Who am I? I'm Spider-Man. Who am I? I'm Spider-Man, given a job to do.
Who are you?
I don't know.
With Holland on the other hand, he doesn't. Him being accused of murder was dropped so quickly and there were 0 legal ramifications for him or his family, which is not how this would have gone down. He doesn't even have to suffer any physical consequences, which we'll talk more about in the action segment. Now thankfully, he does take responsibilities for his actions later, and it's at these points that the movie becomes really enjoyable as he goes through some serious consequences. But for most of the film prior, mainly in that first hour, he doesn't. And it feels like we are just watching a generic MCU film, even though the stakes that were set up from the previous film was anything but generic. Then we get Miles. Now Miles goes through his own origin story, and the whole film is essentially him trying to get the hang of his powers and become the new Spider-Man. And a big part of his development comes from the fact that he can't get the hang of his powers, and he is constantly reminded of that when he's around the Multiverse Spider-Mans who are so much more experienced than him, and it frustratingly makes him look at himself as a failure in comparison. And his mentor figure is this down on his luck Peter Parker, who initially wants nothing to do with him, but then eventually takes him under his wing. And this leads us to the development of the Multiverse Spider-Mans. Now watch this explanation scene from Into the Spider-Verse.
You see, I was in New York, but things were different. Also, I was dead. I have a feeling that the thing that brought me here was the thing that got him killed.
Now that's very easy to understand, isn't it? Now listen to the way the Spider-Mans try to explain it in No Way Home.
This might seem kind of weird, but I've been trying to find your friend ever since I got here. I just have this sense that he needs my help.
Our help.
No Way Home doesn't explain how the Spider-Mans came to this realization like the ones in Spider-Verse did. They start to explain it, and then they abruptly stop and don't mention it again. Almost like the writers for the movie didn't even know how to have this make sense, so they tried to avoid having the characters talk about it. So although the multiverse idea here is really cool, the execution feels very half-baked and like more of an excuse to bring the different Spider-Mans in, rather than a legitimately good storytelling tool like Into the Spider-Verse.
So, how did you get here?
Well, it's kind of a long story. Maybe not that long.
The two standout scenes with them that felt very genuine is when the three Peters relate to each other with the losses that they suffered. This is exactly the conversation I wanted them to have ever since I heard they were gonna be in this movie. And when they talk to each other in the lab, I like how Maguire makes the connection to what Garfield is thinking and then asks if he has anyone. And they both talk about their very different relationship situations. That felt very genuine and authentic to the characters, and I really liked that a lot. But aside from those scenes, there were a lot of times where their interactions felt like Saturday Night Live improv, especially when they're talking about the villains that they went up against and how Andrew Garfield is amazing.
Can we rewind it back to the I'm lame part? Because you are not. You're amazing. Just to take it in for a minute.
Yeah, I can take it in. No, I can take it in.
You are amazing.
I can take it in.
You are amazing.
Thank you, yeah, thanks.
Will you say it?
No, I kind of needed to hear that.
It felt a lot more like the actors talking to each other rather than the characters talking to each other. And I really wish they did not do that, as it really cheapens their characters and doesn't make them feel authentic as we knew them to be. So yeah, the goofy MCU side of these movies did have an impact on them, and it does not properly fit their behavior or the execution of their own films. They did really good in these few scenes, but the rest felt off the mark for me. Into the Spider-Verse, however, doesn't have this problem, and all the Spider-Mans act like their own characters from beginning to end and feel very consistent. Most of their dialogue is all story-based and comes from a very personal place with regards to their experiences, and they're still able to do a lot of humor as well. And I like how their spider senses tell them that they are seeing another Spider-Man. That was a very small but effective detail that would immediately give them an identifiable connection to one another.
I was the only one. You're like me.
I don't want to be.
I don't think you have a choice, kiddo.
And as well as giving Miles an arc, this movie also gives Peter Parker an arc. And from being this lonely, depressed, weirdly shaped man, through mentoring Miles, he rediscovers what it's like to be Spider-Man, and they both help each other. So this movie is really the story of two Spider-Men, not just one Spider-Man.
When will I know I'm ready?
You won't. It's a leap of faith. That's all it is, Miles. A leap of faith.
And no one says this, but the heart of this movie to me is the relationship and mentorship of Miles Morales and Peter Parker, which honestly is exactly what a Miles Morales origin story should be. And that's what I came away remembering the most about this movie, is how they both teach each other to be Spider-Man. One for the first time, and the other for a second time.
How do I know I'm not gonna mess it up again?
You won't.
Right. It's a leap of faith. Not bad, kid.
So the movies that did the best with the multiverse is Into the Spider-Verse and then No Way Home. And to conclude this segment, the movie with the superior Spider-Mans is Into the Spider-Verse, Spider-Man 3, and finally, No Way Home. Willem Dafoe did an amazing job in No Way Home as the Green Goblin. He was the only character in this movie that was not affected at all by the MCU's comedic writing. And I would say that he was the closest to what his character was in Raimi's first Spider-Man. And he is the main villain in this film, but again, only for the last hour. And after that, he disappears and then suddenly comes back for the last few minutes of the climax. How very Amazing Spider-Man 2 of you. And this comes to my big problem with the villains. They are fun to watch, but when you get down to it, they don't have any story arc. They are literally here just to cause some trouble and fight Spider-Man. They don't have any agenda of their own other than to blow stuff up. And that will be fine for a Saturday morning cartoon, but if you're going to be bringing all of these villains into this one movie, then you would expect them to have a much bigger role. But unfortunately, they don't. If anything, they just add to the plot holes that I was talking about earlier.
Osborn?
Otto Octavius should not have known that Green Goblin was Norman Osborn. Now Octavius would have known Norman because he worked for him at Oscorp, and then after his death he worked for Harry, but the only person that knew Norman Osborn was the Green Goblin at this point was Peter, and he kept it a secret. And then in Spider-Man 3, we find out that the butler, Bernard, knew as well. Those were the only two people that knew the identity of the Green Goblin. So for Otto to identify him in No Way Home and then explain his backstory was a gigantic plot hole.
You know him, don't you?
Norman Osborn. Brilliant scientist. But he was greedy. It can't be him. Because Norman Osborn died.
Green Goblin? Impaled by the glider you flew around on.
And this is a prime example of basic incompetence with the storytelling that you would not expect. I mean, how clumsy could you be to forget something like that? And then you have Sandman, who very quickly turns on Spider-Man and goes crazy. I was shocked at how forced Sandman's villainous turn was here, especially when he is not a villain in the Raimi movies. The movie is full of conveniences. Suddenly Stark's nanosuit has an ability where it can pair itself and be used as a remote control. We need to send the villains back. Oh, we have this magical box that can do everything we need it to. Spider-Man is going to cure all of the villains, and they just go along with it, even though no one can change that easily, especially supervillains. We need Sandman to fight Spider-Man, so we'll just have him turn evil, even though this Sandman was never evil and just wanted to save his daughter. But yeah, sure, have him choose to stay here for some reason and completely neglect his daughter and let her die. Spider-Man has spider sense, but with all of Stranger's skills, he can't take this box off him. Stranger's spell only brings in people that specifically know that Spider-Man is Peter Parker. Well, we want Electro in here too, even though he never knew the identity of Spider-Man.
I just thought you was gonna be black.
Oh, and let's bring in Tom Hardy's Venom as well, even though he has never even seen a Spider-Man. You see, this is what I mean with the amount of conveniences that are in this movie, and there are plenty more in the film. The villains can be fun to watch, but the way they are integrated into the movie is very lousy. In fact, the best way I can sum up this whole multiverse storyline in No Way Home is with this line from Spider-Man 2.
Brilliant but lazy.
Now in Spider-Verse, Kingpin hires Lady Octavius and has her make this multiverse machine as he wants to use it to obtain another version of his wife and child. One that didn't see him try to kill Spider-Man and more importantly, are alive. And that blows up in his face all at once when all the different versions of them throughout the multiverse see him doing the same thing again. And it was kind of tragic to see that happen to him, which is surprising that the movie makes you feel that when you take into consideration that he actually killed a Spider-Man earlier on in the movie, and killed Miles' Uncle Aaron. Speaking of which, Uncle Aaron was a big surprise in this film, because I did not expect him to be a villain in this movie, and not just any villain, Kingpin's right-hand villain. And the look of shock on Miles' face, as well as the music, this was a great scene and it felt incredibly dark, like it was the ultimate betrayal, and watching him die in the end was also very surprising and sad. Although I did want to know more about him and why he ended up becoming a villain, because he had no problem watching Kingpin kill a Spider-Man right in front of him, but later on when he finds out that Miles is Spider-Man, he says this.
You're the best of all of us, Miles. You're on your way. Just keep going.
So, did he snap out of his villainous beliefs all at once when he saw Miles as Spider-Man? Or did he hate Spider-Man before, hence he had no problem pursuing him? Or did Kingpin have something on him? I wish we would have gotten more information in this area. And then we get Sandman, Harry, and Venom in Spider-Man 3. And I gotta say, I like Sandman's arc. He's introduced as this bad person, but you feel that something isn't right. He is clearly a criminal because he's being chased by the police, but almost immediately, something seems off. He doesn't seem as bad as you think he is, and he has the most beautiful villainous origin scene ever, and no comic book movie has even come close to topping this scene yet. And I liked his motivation, the fact that he wanted to save his daughter and it led him down this dark path. Although, his motivation for fighting Spider-Man was weak, and it goes against everything the movie was trying to say about his character.
Not a bad person. Just had bad luck.
The video game actually did it better here. Venom tells him, hey, let's kill Spider-Man, and Sandman says that he wants Spider-Man out of the way, he doesn't want to kill anyone, to which Venom does this.
Watch your temper here. There's children present.
So although this storyline is not perfect either, it makes a lot more sense and is more true to his character. But in the movie, it just doesn't connect in that way. Aside from that though, I love the conversation that he has with Peter at the end and that Peter forgives him. I really like the way the scene was very slowly unfolding and it was very tranquil. And then it leads to Harry's death, which I remember watching and I thought it was so sad. Even though Harry getting amnesia was something that I really did not like, whenever he is trying to hurt Peter, that stuff is great, but the amnesia thing really felt like it was only there to slow that plot point down so they could get to the Venom stuff, which is another reason why Venom shouldn't have been in this movie. He just took time away from the most important aspects of the film. Even though I did enjoy many of his scenes, they are fun to watch for the most part, but they definitely did more harm to the film than good. So which movie has the superior villains? Well, both Spider-Man 3 and No Way Home have some weak writing with their villains, but Spider-Man 3 is clear with the motivation behind all of its villains. Harry has his motive, Sandman has his, and Eddie Brock as Venom even has his. Meanwhile, the only villain that has a motive in No Way Home is Green Goblin, who says that we have a second chance to become villains again. And that's about it. They all fight Spider-Man, and then they disappear until the climax. They fight, and then it's all over. When it was all said and done, their impact honestly felt very lightweight, and it didn't have the same weight to it that the villain's plotline should have had. So the movie with the superior villains is Into the Spider-Verse, Spider-Man 3, and finally, No Way Home. Sam Raimi is great at directing action. He did an amazing job in Spider-Man 1 and 2, and he just got even better in Spider-Man 3. The cinematography is stellar. The way the camera is positioned during the action scenes is so creative and full of energy, and the fight with Black Suit Spider-Man and Sandman was awesome. And it has a shot that is so iconic and one of the most creative shots of Spider-Man fighting his villains. The fight with Peter and Harry was also really cool, and much like his fight with the Green Goblin, was very grounded and surprisingly brutal, and the scene was perfectly paced in its build-up and execution. And honestly, I loved the big action scene in the climax too, and watching both Peter and Harry team up with their attacks and their mode of transportation, it is the first time we saw a couple of heroes team up in action scenes like this, and it still holds up so well today, even though No Way Home seems to have completely forgot about it.
I don't know how to work as a team.
Me neither.
How on earth could you miss a detail like that? And then they messed up again with this detail.
Do you have a best friend too?
I did. He died in my arms after he tried to kill me. It's heartbreaking.
Right after he tried to save you, not kill you. And Maguire's Peter would never speak ill of the memory of his best friend like that. He would keep the memory of his best friend positive. He would keep the troubles of their friendship private. He wouldn't talk about it as if it were a joke, but this is clearly MCU dialogue, prioritizing the joke over the story and characters. Also, he died in Mary Jane's lap, not his arms.
He died in my arms.
Going back to the action for Spider-Man 3, I also liked how fast-paced the action was and how the music perfectly complemented it. The way it shares the anger of the characters and even the way it emphasizes and switches between teamwork and tragedy so seamlessly during the action scenes all comes through so well. And I loved how the music got more and more fast-paced and intense as Peter was running out of time to get out of the symbiote web before he hit the ground. The music really played a huge part in this entire movie. And a lot of action scenes that would be all CGI today were mostly, if not entirely practical and shot in camera. I was so surprised to find out that the Sandman battle was shot on a set and they actually released all of this water. Action scenes in Spider-Man movies and other MCU movies now are completely created in a computer and they don't hold a candle to this old school style of filmmaking. Most of the action scenes in this movie have a perfect mix of CGI and practical effects. And yeah, say what you will about Spider-Man 3, Sam Raimi really has an eye for action. He demonstrated that with his previous two Spider-Man films, and he has only gotten better with Spider-Man 3. As for the action in No Way Home, well, there is one action scene that I really want to talk about, and that is the fight between Peter and the Green Goblin in the apartment. Much like his fights against Maguire, this action scene felt the most grounded, and Willem Dafoe proves that even without the mask, he is still a very intimidating bad guy. I would dare say, even more so with the mask off. And they even had him laugh as he was getting punched, which I found very reminiscent to the scene when Joker laughed after repeatedly getting punched by Batman in The Dark Knight. Even Spider-Man's very comic book moves come across more raw and real in this fight. It really was a very well realized fight scene, and it even had some practical effects, which is not at all common in an MCU movie. And Willem Dafoe said that he wanted to do all of his stunts, so practically this whole action scene is done with Willem Dafoe. Aside from that though, I thought the action in this movie was so underwhelming. The short fight with Holland fighting Dr. Octopus was okay, certainly nothing compared to the amazing fight scene we got with him in Spider-Man 2, and this thing came out of nowhere and was such an easy fix. And the fight scene with Doctor Strange, although fun and definitely creative with the way Peter takes Strange out, it had some moments that just made no sense. And I feel that if the movie wasn't so against Doctor Strange, he would have easily been able to get a box from Spider-Man, because honestly, with his skill set, he should so easily be able to win here. Also, how does Tom Holland's Spider-Man get blown up and his injuries look exactly the same as they did before the explosion? I mean, when Maguire got blown up like this, he was a mess, but here, nothing. The same with that bullet to the shoulder. When Garfield got shot, the wound stayed with him for a while before he patched it up with his webs. But with Holland, they never bring it up again. So even the injuries during the action feel very scripted and convenient in this film. But probably the biggest letdown with this film's action is the climactic action scene with all three Spider-Men. This scene should be amazing, full of creativity, super fast paced, and showcase different combat styles of each Spider-Man. But instead, the action was none of those things, and it came across as mediocre. There was no specific memorable moments. What I mean by this is that there was no part of the action scene where you say, hey, do you remember when Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield did that iconic move that they did from their previous films? And do you remember how all three of them combined their moves to take the villain down together? And do you remember how one Spider-Man saved the other? There was just no sense of the action topping itself and getting better and more intense as it went along. The fights were generally all done one-on-one, and there was no real creativity with any of them, both with their cinematography, directing, or even the Spider-Man's fight choreography. Honestly, the one-on-one fight scenes that these Spider-Mans had with their villains in their own movies were much better than the one-on-one fights they had with them here. It was definitely cool to see the three Spider-Mans together in an action scene, but it had the potential to be so much better, and instead, it felt very rushed and basic. And I don't know what the heck this was in the movie for. The movie made this out to be a big deal, especially with how loud that stab was, but it turned out to be nothing apparently, so much so that they could have cut the scene out altogether and you never would have realized that he got stabbed in the first place. And after his great fight scene and villainous turn, the Green Goblin pretty much just disappears from the movie until the final battle where he just randomly shows up for about 5 minutes. I mean, where was he all this time? So apart from the fight with Tom Holland and the Green Goblin in the apartment, the creativity was really lacking in the action scenes in No Way Home, and I feel like that is down to the director John Watt's pretty basic and bare bones directing with his 3 Spider-Man films. And then we get to the action in Into the Spider-Verse, and I'm not kidding here, this is the kind of action that we should have gotten in Spider-Man No Way Home. The action is so fast-paced and full of creativity in every frame, there are tons of memorable moments, the Spider-Mans actually team up and help each other several times, and they even combine moves to take the villains down. And when all the Spider-Mans are in a room together fighting the bad guys, it is absolute chaos. You can watch this scene several times and see new bits of fight choreography that you didn't notice the first, second, or even the third time. And you can see the relationship and friendship between the different Spider-Mans just with their unique fighting styles. You could also see it grow when they came in and saved one another, and this only made their departure and goodbyes to each other all the more sad. This is the kind of feeling that I wanted from the teamwork in No Way Home, and aside from having a simple team-up, I did not feel the emotions or their relationship grow anywhere near as much as the relationships between these Spider-Mans. Once the battle was over, I didn't see a decent team, I saw a family.
Guess this is it. Well, nice to know we're not alone. Right?
Yeah.
And from that perspective, Spider-Man No Way Home didn't even come close to the action scenes and the character development that came with Spider-Verse. Although I do call bullshit on how Kingpin got on that train. So yeah, this really is a tie between Into the Spider-Verse and Spider-Man 3, and my opinions really does go back and forth between these two movies, but at the time of making this video, the movie with the superior action is Spider-Man 3, followed very, very closely by Spider-Verse, and finally, Spider-Man No Way Home. It might seem like I hate Spider-Man No Way Home, but I don't. I just think it needed better writers. It has a lot of great ideas, but they weren't executed in the best way, if at all. But honestly, I started to really like this movie as soon as the Green Goblin showed up. That's when stuff started to get really good, and the darker and more serious tone worked wonders. I just wish that most of the movie had the intense tone that this 5 minutes had, and that it maintained its growing momentum and feeling of tension. But instead, the final battle that it led to was just okay. day, and the beating that Holland's Peter gives the Goblin is nowhere near as brutal or satisfying as the beating that Maguire gave him in the first Spider-Man movie. But having said that, I really love the place this movie leaves Holland's Spider-Man. It finally put him in the place that I wanted to see from his Spider-Man. So the movie overall is fun, but if you break it down to its individual components, it's not as well made as the other two Spider-Man films in this comparison. Because whereas the other movies were intimately made and could take their time, Spider-Man No Way Home was rushed in its production from beginning to end. So much so that the special effects supervisor said that even when the film was released in theaters, they were still working on the effects for the home release. That is a despicable practice that I feared would happen one day, and now it has. First it happened to video games, and now movies. And they charged us full price for our tickets to see an unfinished film. So much for the superior cinema experience. And as I said, a lot of the emotional scenes are tainted by the previous two movies. Because if Homecoming and Far From Home developed their characters better, then I would have felt much worse when bad things happened to them in No Way Home. But because they didn't develop them properly, I didn't care anywhere near as much as I should have. The movie also feels very chopped up and taped together, and that is especially noticeable when we cut to Sandman and Dr. Connors in the climax and when the characters go home. They use very obvious archive footage from Spider-Man 3 and The Amazing Spider-Man 1, and because this movie's production was rushed, you can tell that they didn't have the actors on time, so they just write dialogue to justify why we don't see them again.
Just stay right here.
And then they use this archive footage of him later when he disappears. And as well as the lackluster cinematography and directing, you get the obvious plot holes, such as Octavius and Sandman knowing that Norman was the Green Goblin, Doctor Strange's spell bringing in Electro, Sandman suddenly becoming a villain when all he wants is to go home to his daughter, the extremely obsessive amounts of CGI. Stuff like that just shows how taped and slapped together this movie was and how most of it was an afterthought. And I think it could have been so much better made than it ended up being. And Spider-Man 3, despite its flaws, it felt like it had a passion behind the filmmaking, the fantastic mix of practical and special effects, Sandman's birth that was beautifully combined with tragic music that explained Sandman's tragedy and motivation. Touches like these show the love that Sam Raimi has for the world of Spider-Man, even though a studio came in and tainted it, something they continue to do with their movies to this day. And then you have Into the Spider-Verse that is meticulously crafted and has practically created a new art style and managed to cram so many character arcs into one movie. And it doesn't feel bloated in the slightest. And it has a very moving and emotional story. Watching Miles try to live up to the potential of Spider-Man but struggling to do so even a little bit was sad to see. And the rest of the Spider-Mans tell him to sit the fight out. They're not being cruel or singling him out, they genuinely do see the tragedy of the whole situation. And seeing him work his way through his arc was so satisfying and emotional to see. And his origin is definitely worthy of Spider-Man. It's time for the scores. Spider-Man 3 isn't a great movie, but when you exclude the symbiote, I really like the story with the characters and even Peter's development and loss. The action scenes were great, and I feel that over time, the dust has settled, and even though I acknowledge that it isn't great, the film is still a very easy watch for me after all these years, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Spider-Man No Way Home's first hour and 20 minutes had good stuff in it, but it was a 4 out of 10. I was really unimpressed by it. But the last hour was more of a low 8 out of 10. So when you get down to it, my final score for No Way Home is a low 7 out of 10. And Into the Spider-Verse, as I said in my previous review, keeps getting better each time I see it. And this time was no different. And it moves up to a 9 out of 10. At the end of the day, this is just another MCU movie, and that didn't cut it for me. I want the MCU to raise the bar with their storytelling, but they're not doing it. They're just finding ways to distract us by bringing in different kinds of crossovers, and now they're combining crossovers with nostalgia. But that's it. If anything, the storytelling in this movie was worse than their previous attempts, as there are so many plot holes in this whole multiverse storyline, and they threw away a perfectly unique and fresh storyline to make way for another crossover. Was it good? Yes, but it shouldn't have been good. It should have been amazing. And it wasn't. Into the Spider-Verse was a much better version of the multiverse storyline, and if No Way Home executed its story as good as Spider-Verse did, then I would be very impressed. But it ended up being less thought out and more rushed. And the proof is in the Holland, as he said that when they were shooting, the director for this movie admitted that he didn't know what the story is and that he's figuring it out as they go. I mean, I applaud him for coming up with this on the fly, but that's not how great stories are made. That's why it had so many plot holes and felt so rushed. And as a result, the movie ended up being
brilliant but lazy.
And I left the movie thinking that it was fun, but it could have been so much more. None of these are perfect Spider-Man movies to me. Spider-Man 3 has a lot of good stuff in it, but there is a lot of stuff that didn't work. The main one being the stuff that the studio forced into the film. Into the Spider-Verse is the best movie with regards to its fully fleshed out story and characters, as well as a touching story between them that can be hilarious and downright tragic and emotional at times, but the pop songs and the hip-hop took the emotional elements out for me, and they weren't anywhere near as effective as the orchestral score for the film. This is also the first movie that when it ends, I was like, yeah, Tom Holland has finally become Spider-Man. Not Spider-Boy or Iron Boy, which is exactly what he was before. He was a sidekick, and with the way the movie ends, he has now become Spider-Man, and I am more interested to see what his future movies have in store for him. But my sister said it best. They'll most likely just screw it up and make it all funny again. Regardless, they are in a very good place to start over. Let's just hope they don't ruin it. That's it. That ends the conclusion to my trilogy of Spider-Man Versus videos. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me for all these years. It was a long trip, but we have finally come to the end of the Spider-Man Versus videos. I have plenty more videos on the way, so stay tuned as you will not want to miss them. And the new Spider-Man No Way Home, More Fun Stuff extended cut, man, that was a mouthful. Once that gets a home release, I will watch and do a quick movie review of it. And if you want to see additional content such as trailer reactions, then head on over to my Patreon, where all you have to do is just donate $1 to unlock all of my additional content. The most recent thing I did on Patreon was a reaction to the Black Adam trailer. Thanks again as always for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it. And I will see all of you next time. Take care.